Before we start, hit like and subscribe and drop a comment telling me what you do for work. Tonight's stories all start the same way. Someone alone, late at night, doing a job most people don't think twice about. A security shift, a delivery run, an overnight stocking job that pays okay and doesn't ask much. And then something happens that changes the way they see every quiet night that comes after. 13 stories from people who were just doing their jobs when everything went wrong. Let's get into it. Story 1, the warehouse. I worked overnight security at a small distribution warehouse on the edge of an industrial park. The company stored high-end electronics, laptops, tablets, that kind of thing, which is why they kept a security guard on site around the clock. But despite the value of what was in there, the job was almost insultingly boring. I'd monitor the cameras, do an hourly walkthrough, fill out a report that said nothing to report, eat whatever I'd packed, and watch the clock. 8 months of that. 8 months of nothing. The night everything changed, it was raining, not a light drizzle but a sustained, heavy downpour that turned the roof into white noise and swallowed every other sound in the building. I remember thinking it was actually a good night for the job because nobody in their right mind would be out in that weather. I'd done my 1 a.m. walkthrough, confirmed everything was locked and in order, and was back at the monitor desk writing up my routine report when the latch sensor on the rear loading door triggered an alert. I pulled up the camera feed for that door immediately. The alley behind the building was empty, just rain bouncing off the asphalt and the dull glow of the streetlight at the far end. I watched it for a full minute. Nothing moved. I figured it was a sensor fault, those things triggered on humidity sometimes, or if the wind had been strong enough to flex the door in its frame. Still, protocol required a physical check, so I walked back there, punched off the alarm, and pushed the door open into the rain. I stuck my head out and looked both ways down the alley. Nothing. No footprints in the pooling water that I could make out, no movement at the fence line, nothing on the fire escape above. The door hardware looked clean. I closed it, reset the sensor, and went back to finish my paperwork. 12 minutes later, maybe 15, I heard a thud from somewhere inside the building. Not the roof, this was at floor level from deeper in the storage section. I went still immediately and listened. The rain made it hard to isolate anything, but I was almost certain what I'd heard was real. I waited another 30 seconds. It didn't repeat. I stood up and walked the main hallway slowly, sweeping my flashlight along the rows of shelving, checking the cross aisles as I passed them. Everything in the storage section looked undisturbed. Then I got to the front of the building. The main entrance was wide open. Rain was blowing in across the threshold, and on the concrete floor just inside the door was a trail of wet boot prints leading toward the storage section, the section I'd just come from. I turned around and walked quickly back to the security room without running, which I'm still not sure was the right call. I hit the emergency line and told them I had a probable intruder on site and needed police immediately. Then I stayed in the room with the door locked and watched the camera feeds. For the next 18 minutes, I could see nothing on the cameras. The intruder knew where they were or had gotten lucky staying out of frame, but I heard periodic sounds from the deep storage area. A shift, a scrape, then silence. The silence was almost worse than the sounds. When the officers arrived, I met them at the front and walked them to the area where I'd last heard movement. They moved through the rows of shelving with flashlights while I stayed back. It took them about 4 minutes. They found him crouched behind a stack of wooden pallets in the rear corner of the storage bay near the loading dock. He was holding a hammer in both hands, one wrapped over the head, one on the grip, and according to the officer who physically pulled him out, he hadn't dropped it voluntarily. He had to be told 3 separate times to set it down before he did. The incident report said he was heavily intoxicated and gave no coherent account of why he'd entered the building or what he intended to do with the hammer. No prior record of targeting the business. No known motive. The investigation closed without a satisfying explanation, which I was told was more common than people think in these situations. What I remember most is the way he looked at me as they walked him out. Not frightened, not angry, just calm, patient, almost, the way someone looks when they were interrupted rather than caught. Like the plan wasn't finished. Like he was making a note to come back. I gave my notice that week and found a different job within the month. I still don't work alone in large, empty buildings. Story 2. The Abandoned Hospital. I'm a patrol officer and have been for going on 9 years. Early in my career, probably my 2nd year on the job, I got dispatched to a trespassing complaint at a decommissioned hospital on the eastern edge of town. The building had been closed for about 12 years at that point. It was structurally sound but stripped of anything valuable, and it had become well known in the area as a spot where teenagers went to hang out, drink, and dare each other to explore the dark corridors. My department had cleared it out several times in the 3 years before that call. Everyone knew the building. Everyone had been there. The procedure was routine. Park outside, announce at the entrance, listen for running, sweep the building, write it up. Maybe arrest someone if they got stupid about it, but usually they just scattered. I pulled up, got out, and immediately noticed a flashlight beam moving fast across the 2nd floor windows. Not the slow, wandering movement of someone exploring, but quick and erratic, like someone running. I called out the standard announcement at the entrance and went in. The ground floor was clear. I could tell immediately. The acoustics in an empty building tell you a lot, and there was nothing down there but settling sounds and the wind through a broken window on the east side. I took the stairwell to the 2nd floor. The hallway stretched out in both directions from the landing, long and completely dark except for where my flashlight cut through it. I shone it to the far end. Nothing. Then a thud from somewhere behind the walls, heavy, like a body impacting a surface, followed by silence. I moved down the hallway and cleared each room as I went. Old gurneys, stripped fixtures, graffiti, broken ceiling tiles. Nobody. The last door was closed. I called out one final time, then swung it open and cleared the room. Empty. But on the floor, unmistakably, 2 cigarettes were burning down. No more than 3 or 4 minutes old. Whoever had been in that room had left it in a hurry very recently. Before I could fully process that, the door behind me slammed hard enough to shake the frame, and something heavy, a gurney, as it turned out, scraped across the floor against it. I hit the door with my shoulder and managed to force it open just enough to get through. I could hear footsteps already at the far end of the hall. By the time I reached the landing, they were on the ground floor and out the exit. I found the door swinging in the wind. No one in sight. Backup swept the building thoroughly. What they found: one clear set of footprints through the dust on the 2nd floor. One flashlight left in one of the rooms, the beam still on when they found it, battery almost dead. The cigarettes had been smoked to nearly the same length, suggesting 2 people, but only one set of footprints, and no second exit from the 2nd floor that anyone could have used without passing me on the stairs. 2 missing persons reports came in before my shift ended that morning. 2 teenage boys, both last seen the previous evening heading toward the abandoned hospital. Friends of theirs told investigators that was definitely where they'd gone. That was 6 years ago. They have not been found. The partial footprint pattern recovered at the scene doesn't match either of them. Whatever happened in that building that night, I was a floor below it, and I still don't know what I was dealing with. That case sits in a file I've read more times than is probably healthy. Story 3: The Supply Room. I worked the overnight shift at a highway gas station for about 11 months, 11 to 7, alone after midnight when the second employee went home. The station sat on a stretch of highway between two towns, surrounded mostly by farmland, and it served truckers and the occasional late driver. Most nights the biggest event was a fuel pump timing out or a coffee machine running low. Nothing dramatic, just quiet, fluorescent-lit vending machine hum quiet. This particular night was mid-January. Heavy snow, wind-driven, the kind that cuts your visibility down to maybe 20 feet past the pump canopy. Temperatures were well below freezing. I wasn't expecting a single customer. Around 12:30 a.m., an older dark-colored SUV pulled in slowly and stopped at one of the far pumps. I watched it briefly, assumed the driver was running their card at the pump, and went back to my phone. 10 minutes later, I glanced up and it was still there. Engine off, headlights off, no movement. No one at the pump, no one walking toward the building. In that temperature, sitting in a dead car for 10 minutes without the heat running was genuinely dangerous. I put on my coat, pushed through the front door, and walked out to check. The cold hit me immediately, the kind of cold that makes your eyes water in the first breath. The car was empty. I looked in through the driver's side window with my flashlight. Nothing on the seats, nothing I could see that would explain why someone had stopped here and then vanished. I looked around the lot in both directions. No one at the building, no one near the road. The only thing I noticed was a trail of boot prints in the snow leading from the driver's side door toward the side of the building, where the service entrance was. They were fresh, the snow was filling them in as I watched, but the outline was still sharp enough to follow. I was freezing, and the service entrance wasn't my door to use, so I went back inside to warm up before investigating further. I was at the counter maybe 45 seconds, hands in front of the small space heater I kept under the register, when a thud came from somewhere at the back of the store. Solid impact, floor level, the direction of the supply room. I came out from behind the counter and walked down the far aisle slowly. On the floor were muddy melt marks, the kind that come off boots that have been standing in snow. They led toward the back corridor. I turned the corner into the rear section of the store and stopped completely. Standing in the gap between the last storage shelf and the back wall, partially obscured by shadow, was a man. Tall, heavy-set, a heavy dark beard. He wasn't moving. He was looking directly at me and had clearly been looking at me since I turned the corner. I made eye contact. And then, I still don't entirely understand this, I turned around and walked calmly back to the front counter. I think something in my brain refused to process what it was seeing and just defaulted to normal behavior. Whatever the reason, I walked back behind the register, picked up the store phone without looking rushed about it, and called the police in a low voice, whispering the situation and the address. The next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. I didn't hear a single sound from the back of the store. No footsteps, no shifting, no door. Just the hum of the refrigerator cases and the wind against the building. When 2 officers arrived and I pointed them toward the supply room, they were back in under 90 seconds. Empty. The back service door, which required a key from the inside, was standing open. In the snow outside it, tracks led away from the building in a straight line, heading out across the empty field behind the station. Cutting through the dark for as far as the flashlight reached and then disappearing into the blizzard. The SUV had no registered owner on record. The license plate came back to a vehicle that had been reported scrapped 2 years earlier. The man was never identified. The field was searched the following morning. Nothing was found. To this day, I don't know what he was doing standing in that supply room in the dark, waiting. I quit at the end of that week. Story 4: The Park. I was 16 when I got my first job, doing part-time pizza deliveries a couple of evenings a week after school. My town was small enough that I knew most of the streets by memory, and the routes were short, mostly neighborhoods I'd grown up in, familiar addresses, no surprises. The job was dull in the way that first jobs are, and I liked that about it. Nothing was going to happen delivering pizza in a town this size. That's what I told myself. The order came in about 20 minutes before closing on a Friday night. The address was in a neighborhood I barely ever had reason to go to, sparse, poorly lit, more empty lots than houses. The kind of area that sits just past where a town stops feeling like a town. I loaded the bag and set off. The GPS took me through a series of turns I didn't recognize, down roads without sidewalks, past properties with long gaps between them, until it announced I had arrived. On my left was a row of dark residential frontage. On my right was the entrance to a walking path through a small public park, a gap in a chain-link fence with a sign I couldn't read clearly in the dark. The blue pin on my GPS was sitting squarely in the middle of that park, no house anywhere near it. I double-checked the address manually on a second app. Same result, same pin, in the park. I got out with the bag. The path was lit only by whatever ambient light came from the distant street, which wasn't much. Maybe 30 meters in there was a man sitting alone on a wooden bench. He stood up when he saw me approach and started reaching into his jacket, presumably for his wallet. I kept walking toward him, telling myself this was a perfectly explainable situation. Someone who lived near the park and used it as a drop point, or who'd been sitting out on a warm evening and didn't want to go back inside just for this. As I got close enough to hand over the bag, he looked at me, and I mean directly at me, not at the pizza, and his eyes had something in them I recognized even at 16. Pure immediate fear, not surprise, not embarrassment. Fear in the present tense, fear of something that was happening right now. I turned around. A man was standing directly behind me, close enough that I could hear him breathing. He was wearing a cloth mask over his face. He was holding a knife. He told me in a very flat, calm voice to empty my pockets onto the ground. I did it immediately: wallet, keys, phone. He left the keys and the phone and pocketed the wallet. Then he gestured for both of us, me and the man from the bench, to step off the path. We walked into the trees and kept walking, long enough that the light from the path completely disappeared, and the only sound was the three of us moving through undergrowth. I was trying to breathe normally and plan something when the man from the bench shoved me sideways as hard as he could and bolted in the opposite direction. I went down. The masked man went after the one who ran and left me on the ground. I got up and I ran. I didn't look back. I ran all the way to my car, locked myself in, and called the police before I'd gotten my breath back. Neither man was found. I don't know who the man on the bench was, what situation had put him there alone at that hour waiting for someone's pizza to arrive, or what happened to him after he ran. I think about that shove sometimes. He used me to create a distraction and bought himself a few seconds. I can't blame him. But whatever he ran into out there in the dark after the man with the knife caught up, that's something I've never been able to stop imagining. Story 5: The Empty Road. I did pizza delivery for a local shop in my mid-20s. The routes varied, but the latest runs of the night always seemed to go to the same few spots, one part of town that stayed awake, and the road that connected it back to where the shop was. That road ran through about 4 miles of forest, No intersections, no lights, just the occasional reflector post. Fast and empty and direct, which is why I liked it. My last run of the night, around 1:30 a.m., I was about halfway down that road when the car started behaving strangely. Not a mechanical sound, more like the steering had loosened slightly, and there was a resistance to acceleration I couldn't explain. I checked the dashboard. Every light was normal. I kept going, but it got progressively worse over the next half mile until I was barely maintaining 20 miles an hour and the car was shuddering. I coasted to the shoulder and stopped. I sat for a moment with the hazards on, then got out and walked around the car. It was dark enough that my phone flashlight didn't reach the ground clearly, and I wasn't a mechanic. I didn't know what I was looking for. Nothing obvious stood out. I called a coworker who lived close by and asked him to come get me. He said he could be there in 30 minutes. I thanked him, got back in, locked the doors, and turned the music down. I remembered maybe 5 minutes in that as I'd been rolling to a stop, I'd thought I'd seen a figure on the far shoulder, standing in the road maybe 100 meters behind me. I'd clocked it and immediately explained it away as a trick of the headlights in the fog. I checked the mirrors now. Nothing, just the red pulse of my hazards against the trees. I waited. The music stayed low. 20 minutes, 25. At around the 28-minute mark, I heard something outside the car. Footsteps, not on the road, but coming from inside the tree line on the passenger side, getting progressively louder as whatever was making them got closer. The trees were too dense and it was too dark to see anything through the passenger window. Then a man walked out of the forest directly to my driver's side, smooth and unhurried, like he'd done this before, and knocked on the window. He was smiling. He said something I couldn't make out through the glass. I said through the window that I couldn't roll it down. He nodded, still smiling, reached for the door handle and tried it locked, then moved around to the back of the car. In my rear view, I watched him position himself at the rear bumper, shifting something in his hands, adjusting it, like he was preparing something. My coworker's headlights came through the fog from down the road just then. The man watched the lights approach for a moment, then walked quickly into the tree line on the opposite side of the road and was gone. My coworker had seen him clearly in the headlights as he crossed. He told me in the car on the way back that the man had been carrying a gun. We called the police from the car. The tow truck retrieved my car the next morning, and they found the fuel gauge was stuck. The tank had been completely empty for who knows how long, though I had no idea when or how that happened. The police found no one matching the description in the area. I've driven that road dozens of times since. I've never taken it at night again. Story 6: The Bonfire. This was during the height of the pandemic lockdowns. Almost every restaurant in town was closed for in-person dining, which meant the ones that were still doing delivery were absolutely buried. I'd started delivering for a local pizza place when my other work dried up, and I was pulling long shifts right up to close, usually around 1 a.m. At about 12:15, I accepted what I assumed would be my last order of the night, 4 large pizzas to an address listed about 30 minutes outside of town. The payout was good, and I figured it would be a quiet drive to cap the evening. I picked up the order and headed out. The roads were completely empty, which was typical those days. Curfew mentality had settled over everything, and most people weren't moving around after dark. When my GPS put me at the destination, I found myself at a property that had a real driveway with an open gate but led to nothing. A cleared area of ground, flat gravel, and then woods in all directions. No building at the end of it. I pulled in and parked and got out, thinking I must have the wrong address, and that's when I noticed the light coming from inside the trees. Orange and flickering, A fire, large enough that the glow reached the edge of the clearing. And voices, low, a group of people. Someone stepped in front of the light and raised an arm, waving me over. I spent about 10 seconds deciding. 4 pizzas meant a group. A group in the woods around a fire during lockdown was unusual but not impossible. People were doing all kinds of things to cope with being stuck inside. I could hear them talking. It sounded normal. I got the bags from the back seat, left my headlights on pointing into the trees and walked toward the fire. 8 people when I arrived, maybe 9, some standing, some sitting on logs. Nobody looked up when I came through. No one reacted to the pizza arriving the way you'd expect people who'd been waiting for food to react. No movement toward me, no reaching for bags, no conversation. They were all oriented toward the fire, not speaking to each other, completely still. I stood at the edge of the site holding 4 pizza bags and nobody acknowledged me for a solid 10 seconds. Then a man walked over, took all 4 boxes out of my hands without a word and passed them sideways to someone else. I said the total. No response. Before I could try again, I heard movement in the trees behind me. More people coming in from the dark. I counted at least 5, maybe more, hard to tell in that light. There were now well over a dozen people in that clearing, all standing roughly in a circle, and they were all looking at me. Not the food, me, and none of them were speaking. I turned and walked back toward my headlights. I kept a normal pace because something told me not to run. I watched my footing on the uneven ground, kept my eyes mostly forward and didn't look back. When I came through the tree line and reached my car, 2 figures sprinted away from behind it into the dark. I got in, reversed out of the driveway and drove until I was back on the main road. I called the police once I was moving. They arrived at the site less than an hour after I'd left. The fire was still burning. The clearing was completely empty. The number that placed the order was a prepaid burner. No identification was ever made of who those people were or what they were doing out there. That's 6. Drop a comment telling me which one got to you most and keep watching because the next 7 are worse. Story 7, the gunshot. I managed overnight at a small regional grocery chain, 8 or 9 locations in the area. The kind of local place that had been around long enough that the same families had shopped there for 30 years. My store was unremarkable. The overnight work was stocking shelves, receiving early shipments, and doing the quiet maintenance tasks that couldn't happen during business hours. I was often the only person in the building from midnight until the early morning crew arrived at 5. And in the 2 years I worked there, nothing had ever happened. Nothing. It was one of the reasons I liked the shift. One Tuesday in February, I was working through the center aisles around 2 a.m., breaking down boxes and fronting the shelves, when I heard movement from the front of the store. Not from outside, from inside, near the registers. I set down what I was holding and went to look. A man was inside the building, past the checkout barriers, moving along the far wall toward the back. He wasn't trying to be quiet about it. He saw me at almost the same moment I saw him, and he didn't stop walking. Something in the way he moved, not hurried, not surprised, just continuing, made every warning signal in my body go off simultaneously. I didn't say anything. I turned around and walked in the other direction, away from him, toward the service corridor that led to the front exit. I heard him change his pace behind me, walking faster, then faster. By the time I hit the push bar on the front exit door, I was at a dead sprint, and so was he. I got my key into the exterior deadbolt on the second attempt. My hands were shaking and pushed through. A split second after I cleared the door frame, I heard a pop and a high ringing started in both ears. I didn't stop. I didn't check myself for damage. I went around the side of the building and didn't stop running until I reached my car, got in, locked it, and called 911. He was gone by the time 2 cruisers arrived. The rear delivery door had been forced open with a heavy bolt cutter or pry bar. The tool was still on the ground outside it. Inside the store, the bullet had entered the wall just to the right of the front door frame, at roughly chest height for an average adult. Based on the trajectory, the investigating officer said it appeared to have been fired from approximately the aisle end cap nearest the registers, the direction I'd been running from. The officer characterized it as impulsive rather than premeditated, based on the angle and the circumstances. I don't know if that distinction mattered to me as much as they seemed to think it would. I didn't go back. I picked up my personal items from the store manager the following afternoon and handed in my keys. For about 2 years after that, I'd wake up from a dead sleep certain I'd heard that sound again. I don't anymore, mostly, but I have never since worked alone in an enclosed building at night. Story 8: The X. I work fully remote doing overnight cybersecurity monitoring, scanning code repositories and network logs for anomalies, flagging potential intrusions. The sort of work that sounds more interesting than it actually is when you're doing it at 3 a.m. and nothing has pinged in 4 hours. The pay is good and working from home suits me, but the hours are genuinely difficult to stay awake through, especially in the second half of the shift. One night a few weeks ago, I hit a wall around 2:30 and decided to order food just to give myself a reason to stand up and move around. It was raining heavily outside. I'd barely registered it while working, but when I went to the kitchen window, I was surprised at how hard it was coming down. I placed an order on a delivery app, my only real option at that hour being a fast food place about 15 minutes away, and went back to monitoring while I waited. The app showed the order was picked up in about 9 minutes. I watched the driver's icon move across the map toward my neighborhood, and when they were about a minute out, I got up, went to the front door, and opened it so we could make the handoff as quickly as possible in the rain. I stood in the open doorway watching the end of my street where they should have been turning from. 5 minutes passed. No car. I checked the app. Their icon was showing them stopped just around the corner from my street. I called the number. 4 rings, no answer. I tried again immediately. Voicemail. The icon on the map hadn't moved. I waited another few minutes, shifted in the doorway, tried calling a third time. This time it connected. I asked if they were having trouble finding the address. There was no response, just the sound of rain, close and heavy, like they were standing outside the car. Then the call ended. I refreshed the map. Their icon had updated. It was showing them directly in front of my house. I leaned out the doorway and looked both ways. Nothing. No car, no headlights, no one on the sidewalk. I stepped back inside and pushed the door closed and locked the deadbolt. Maybe 20 seconds later, a knock hit my door hard enough that I felt it through the floor. I went to the peephole. A man in a gray hoodie was on my porch. His head was in constant motion, left, right, checking the street, checking the neighboring houses, back to center. He called out that he had a delivery, but there was no bag in his hands. No insulated carrier. Nothing. He knocked again, harder, called out again. Then he stopped and pressed his body flat against the door, and I heard directly at my ear level through the wood a series of short, scraping sounds. Deliberate, slow, like someone working with a small tool. He ran off the porch and into the rain. By the time police arrived, he was gone, and so was the vehicle. The account he'd used to take the order was registered to a name that didn't match any real address. The platform closed it within 24 hours of my report. 2 days later, I was leaving the house and stopped. On the lower panel of my front door, partially concealed by the door frame's shadow, there was a fresh scratch, an X about 2 inches across. Not decorative, deliberate, intentional, positioned low where I wouldn't notice it at eye level. The officer I showed it to said markings like that had been associated before with second visit targeting. I painted over it that same afternoon. I had a new deadbolt installed the next morning. The feeling that he found what he was looking for that night, that he's noted the address and will be back when conditions are right, is something I haven't fully shaken. Story 9: The Footprints. I managed overnight at a small independent grocery store for about 3 years. The job was straightforward. Stock the shelves, receive early morning shipments when they came, handle any issues with refrigeration or equipment. The store wasn't large, and I was usually the only employee in the building from midnight onward. It was the sort of job you stop thinking about as soon as you clock in because there's nothing to think about. Routine, familiar, safe. It was a Wednesday night and a storm had been building since I started my shift. By midnight it was raining solidly, and the wind had picked up enough that the building was making sounds. The particular groaning and popping of an older structure, adjusting to pressure that you learn to filter out after a few months. I was working the center aisles, breaking down stock boxes and fronting shelves, and I had the radio on low enough that I could still hear the building around me. Sometime around 1:30 a.m. I heard a thud from somewhere near the back of the store, the loading bay area, where the steel delivery door was. It was a solid impact sound, not the building settling. I walked back and checked the door. Sealed. No truck scheduled, nothing outside when I pushed it open an inch to look. I told myself it was the wind finding a weak point somewhere and went back to work. An hour later, I went to the back office for my break. I was in there for about 15 minutes just eating, checking my phone, nothing eventful. When I walked out and headed back toward the aisle I'd been working on, I stopped at the entrance to it and looked down the length of the floor. Boot prints. Wet, muddy, clearly fresh. Running the full length of the aisle in both directions from where I was standing, as though someone had walked up and down it while I was on break. I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, maybe a refrigeration leak. Maybe I'd tracked something in myself, and then I followed the prints. They went up and down that aisle, turned into the next one and the next. They covered the entire floor section I'd been working in. Someone had walked through the entire store methodically while I was in the back room. The prints went toward the front, toward the back, and in a separate trail directly to the office door, stopping there. I went back to that office and locked the door from the inside and called the police immediately. As I sat there waiting, I looked at the floor outside the door through the gap at the bottom. Fresh prints came up to the threshold and stopped. Whoever had been in that store had walked through it, done whatever they were doing in the aisles, and then come and stood outside the office door. Just stood there, then walked away and left. The police reviewed the security footage. A man in a dark jacket had entered through a side door that had been left unlocked. My fault. I hadn't checked it during my setup at the start of the shift. He confirmed through the cameras that I was on break, waited until I went to the office, then spent 12 minutes moving through the store. He picked nothing up. He opened no cases, took nothing from the shelves, went nowhere near the registers. Near the end of the footage, he walked to the office door and stood facing it for just over 3 minutes, looking at the handle. Then he left through the same side door he'd entered from. He was never identified. What he was doing in those aisles and what he decided standing outside that office door, I don't know. I'm not sure I'd want to know even if someone told me. Story 10: The Rope. I've been doing food delivery for about 3 years. It's decent money for flexible hours, and most of the time the weirdest thing that happens is someone's address being listed incorrectly, or having to navigate an apartment complex with no visible building numbers. I'd started to feel like I'd seen every version of an odd drop-off. I hadn't. This was a late season night, early October, the first real cold snap of the year and the first light snowfall. I'd been running orders since 9 p.m. and was tired but picking up one more before calling it. The address was a house about 15 minutes out of town, down a wooded county road, the kind of property that's surrounded by trees on 3 sides and far enough from neighbors that you don't know they exist unless you're looking for them. I found the driveway and pulled up to the house. Medium-sized, older construction, completely dark except for a single dim light in what appeared to be a rear room. Snow covering the porch, undisturbed by recent foot traffic. Nothing obviously wrong. I grabbed the bag and went up to knock. The door opened almost the instant my knuckles left the wood, which made me step back involuntarily. A large man filled the frame, heavy-built, wearing a winter coat like he'd just been outside or was about to go out. His face was a particular shade of pale that I associate with cold or shock. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. I said I had his order and held up the bag with a smile. He stepped backward, pulled the door open wider and said I could set it on the counter in the kitchen, and pointed past himself into the house. The way he said it wasn't an invitation. It had the cadence of an instruction, and the interior of the house beyond him was dark. I couldn't see a kitchen or a counter, just a hallway and darkness. I kept the smile on my face and said I had to get going and held the bag out toward him again. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, exactly, more like a recalculation. Then he took hold of the door and slammed it so hard the hanging porch light swung on its hook. I set the bag down on the porch railing and started walking back through the yard to my car, quickly but not running. I'd cleared the front garden and was on the path to the driveway when I heard a door, not the front, somewhere on the side of the house, and then footsteps in the snow, heavy and moving fast. I turned. He was coming around the corner of the house. Both hands were full. One hand held something coiled, rope, or something like it. The other hand held something else I couldn't identify clearly in the dark, something with more structure to it. I ran. I got in the car, engine on, reversed down the driveway before the door was fully shut. In the headlights, I watched him stop at the edge of the yard where the driveway met the grass. He didn't chase me into the road. He just stood in the light from my reversing lights and watched me go. Patient, unhurried. The expression on his face as I drove away was the part I've turned over the most since then. He didn't look frustrated. He looked like someone who was prepared to wait. Story 11: The Hatch. I manage a 24-hour drive-through location. I've worked there 5 years, made manager 2 years ago. Overnight hours are usually manageable light traffic, straightforward tasks, and by 4 a.m. the morning crew starts filtering in. The shift has a rhythm and I know it well. What I wasn't prepared for was working it entirely alone. My cook called in sick at 11:30. I spent 20 minutes calling down the list of available employees and got nothing, either no answer or a no. So from midnight until 4 a.m. I was doing everything: cooking, taking orders at the window, cleaning, restocking. It was frustrating but manageable. I've run the place. I know every task. I'd gotten through about 2 hours of it without incident. 3 drive-through orders, nothing unusual. I was in the kitchen area scrubbing down the flat top when I heard banging from the front, someone hammering on the glass entrance door. I walked out front and a man was at the door pressing his face to it, looking in and scanning the space methodically like he was taking inventory. I walked up to the door and spoke clearly through the glass. Dining room's closed, drive-through is open, he'd need to come around in a car. He looked at me, didn't react. I pointed at the hours sign on the door. He looked at the sign and then looked back at me and still didn't move. I walked back to the kitchen and gave him a few minutes to figure it out. Maybe 25 minutes later, the drive-through headset signaled a car at the speaker. I put it on and greeted them and got no response. I walked to the window and checked the camera, no car, no one. Sensor glitch, I figured. I reset it and went back to the prep table. I was at the back of the kitchen when I heard the footsteps on the roof. Slow, careful, spaced out, someone moving deliberately to minimize noise. The kind of step you take when you're trying not to be heard. I tracked the sound across the ceiling from one side of the building to the other, and when it stopped I looked up at exactly the corner I'd been dreading since I identified where it was heading. The maintenance hatch. The hatch was a standard-issue roof access panel with a simple interior slide bolt. I'd never used it in 5 years, and I'd never thought about whether it locked securely. I crossed the kitchen and put my hand on the bolt just as the panel shifted above me, not opening, just flexing under weight being applied from outside. Someone was pressing on it to test it. I held the bolt in place. They pushed harder, twice. Then it stopped. Then the hatch opened, slowly a few inches, controlled. And through the gap was a pair of eyes looking directly down at me, looking at my face with what I can only describe as calm recognition, like they'd confirmed something. I ran. Through the kitchen, through the front of the restaurant, out the main door that I unlocked on the move, across the parking lot to my car. I called police from inside the car with the engine running and watched through the restaurant windows. A shadow moved through the back of the dining area, unhurried, then disappeared toward the kitchen. When the officers arrived, they swept the building and the roof. He was gone. Nothing in the building had been taken, moved, or touched. The hatch had been accessed from the outside. There was a ladder on the service side of the building that I'd had no reason to know about. The owner installed an interior padlock the next morning. Footage from the restaurant's cameras showed the man's face clearly. He was in the building for just over 6 minutes. As of the last update I received, he hasn't been identified. I still work that location. I still do overnight shifts. And I still think about the fact that whatever he came in through that hatch to do, he had been at the front door 2 hours earlier, looking in, counting heads. He knew there was only one. Story 12, the RV. I drive for a delivery app most evenings as supplemental income. The work is predictable, and I like that about it. Pick up food, deliver food, repeat. Most orders are to apartment complexes or neighborhood houses within a few miles of the restaurant strip. The occasional odd address breaks the rhythm, but usually resolves into something unremarkable. This order came through around 11 p.m., and the address was at the outer limit of my delivery zone, a road I'd never been on, listed as somewhere past where the last traffic light in the county ended and the county highway started thinning out. No business name, no apartment number, just coordinates on a gravel access road branching off the highway. I accepted it and headed out. The gravel road started where the blacktop stopped. There was a small wooden sign at the turnoff, hand-painted, the lettering weathered to illegibility. I put my brights on and followed the road in. It went about 200 meters through a gap in the tree line, and at the end of it, sitting in the sweep of my headlights, was an old RV. It was heavily weathered, bracketed on both sides by brush that had grown up close against the sides. The address number was hand-painted on the door in sloppy strokes. I verified it against my app. It matched. I got out with the food. Cash order. I'd noted that when I accepted it and thought nothing of it at the time. These things happen. I knocked on the RV door and heard movement inside, a shifting of weight somewhere in the rear. A voice came from my right. A man was standing at the rear corner of the RV, one hand against the siding. He was smiling and said the order was his. I walked it over and handed him the bag. He said he just needed to get the rest of the cash from around back and would be right with me, then walked around behind the RV. I stood where I was. After about a minute, I stepped to the corner and looked around to see where he'd gone. He was 15 meters away, standing beside what I could now make out as a small outbuilding, a shed of some kind, barely visible as a dark shape against the trees. He wasn't walking toward me. He was standing completely still, watching me, and something in his right hand caught the faint reflected light from my headlights, long, straight, the barrel of a rifle or a long bat. I looked at it for 1 second. Behind me, the RV door opened. A different man leaned out. He looked at my face, then at the other man behind me, and then pulled the door shut hard. I walked back to my car, measured pace, keys already in my hand. Got in, locked it, reversed out of the gravel road without turning around, and didn't stop until I was back on the blacktop with streetlights overhead. I drove straight home. I sat in my car in my own driveway for a few minutes before I could make myself go inside. I didn't call the police that night, and I regret that. I kept telling myself I didn't actually know what was happening, that maybe it had an innocent explanation, that I'd overreacted to a strange situation. It's only in the time since that I've stopped being able to make that case to myself. Story 13, the tires. This is the one that still sits with me the most, 4 years after it happened. I'd been doing delivery work long enough to feel like I'd seen the full range of what the job could throw at you. This was something I had no framework for. The order came in during a normal evening shift, a restaurant pickup and delivery to a residential address about 25 minutes out of town, down a rural route that got progressively more isolated as it went. Not unusual in a spread-out county. I picked up the food, checked the address, and headed out. The drive took me through familiar roads and then onto a stretch I knew less well, narrower, tree-lined, the kind of road where there are no other cars and you start to feel like the only person moving in the world. When I pulled up to the address, I found a property that looked entirely normal. A modest house set back from the road, a car in the driveway, a bicycle on the porch, curtains in the windows. The only odd thing was that the house was completely dark, no lights on anywhere, not even the porch light, despite it being 9:30 at night. I figured people go to bed early. I got the bag and went to the door. No doorbell, so I knocked, waited, knocked again, called out the name on the order. Nothing. I waited maybe another 30 seconds, listening. No movement from inside. I set the bag on the porch step and went back to my car. I started the engine and began to turn around in the narrow driveway. Immediately the car responded wrong. I put it in reverse and the feeling was immediately off, too heavy, too dragging, the steering sluggish in a way that had nothing to do with the driveway surface. I stopped and got out and walked around the car, and my stomach went cold. All 4 tires. Flat to the rim, not slowly deflating, completely flattened, each one in a way that made it obvious it hadn't happened naturally. Each tire had been cut while I was at the door. 30 seconds, maybe 45. Someone had moved around my car in complete silence and destroyed all 4 tires in the time it took me to knock and wait and leave the bag, which meant someone was already on that property when I arrived, close enough to reach my car unheard. I got back in immediately and locked the doors. No cell signal on that road. I tried moving the car anyway, forced it forward on the rims, the sound horrible and grinding. The front door of the house opened. A man came down the porch steps quickly, crossing the front yard at a pace that wasn't casual, heading directly for my car. I kept moving. I didn't stop. I forced the car down the driveway and out onto the road on bare rims, the noise unbelievable, watching in the mirror as the man stopped at the edge of the property and stood there. I drove like that for nearly a mile until I had enough signal to call for help. The police response that followed was what turned a frightening experience into something I still can't fully explain. Officers went to the house and spoke to the family inside, a woman and her 2 children, all of whom said they had been home the entire evening. They said they hadn't ordered any food that night. They said they hadn't seen any man on their property. Their accounts were consistent and credible, and there was nothing at the house to contradict them. The order had been placed from a disposable number that was immediately dead when police tried to reach it. Someone ordered food to that house on purpose. They were on the property when I arrived, and they made certain I couldn't leave. They knew the layout, knew the timing, and had a plan for what came next. What that plan was, what would have happened if the car had moved another 30 seconds slower, or if I hadn't forced it out on the rims, I don't know. I don't want to know. The only thing I'm certain of is that whoever arranged that night had done enough planning that I was never supposed to be the one telling the story. Those are 13 stories. 13 nights that started as ordinary shifts, a security round, a stocking job, a delivery run, and became something those people carry around permanently. The common thread isn't a type of criminal or a specific kind of crime. It's the word ordinary. The shift you've done 100 times, the road you know by memory, the route that takes you somewhere just outside of familiar. That's where it happens, not somewhere else, not to someone else. When the job puts you somewhere alone after dark and something feels wrong, trust it. Leave. Nothing you're delivering or guarding or stocking is worth finding out what comes next. Subscribe if you want more stories like these, and I'll see you in the next one.